here. So thank you, Jeff, so much for joining us. And Jeff will be talking to us about the birds of Mount Rainier. Jeff has a long history with the mountain. He's worked at it, he's summited it, he's hiked all of its mapped trails. He has done the Wonderland Trail 5 times. He's written a book about it as well. It's called Tahoma and Its People. He is Emeritus Faculty at the Evergreen State College. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jeff.
Great.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Carla. And good evening, everybody. It's great to be with you. Really good to be doing this. And thanks to Carla for inviting me to join you tonight. I've been a member of the Rainier Audubon chapter for many, many years down here. They're located in Auburn. I live in Enumclaw. And so doing a talk for an Audubon chapter feels kind of like coming home. I feel like I'm with my people. So really good to be with you folks, and good to see a few familiar faces and some familiar names as well. Hello, Sarah Peterson, a colleague and good friend of mine from Evergreen. So good to be with you folks tonight. I have a lot of images to share with you, and so I'm going to get right to those. But 2 notes first. I do have a few audio clips. They're not essential to the presentation, but if you crank up your volume a little bit to make sure that you can hear, there's a few bird calls I'd like you to hear if you can. So I'll play those. And the other thing is, Carla had asked months ago for me, she said, if you could, anything that you could talk about climate change would be fantastic. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but if I miss anything, or just ask me at the end to talk more about climate change and the effects on some of these birds, I could probably add some things. So with that, let's take a look at some images and let's get ourselves started here. Oops. Just a second. All right. Okay, I'm hoping you've got an image that you can see that is of the mountain.
Yes, that looks good, Jeff.
Everybody got that? Okay, great. So most of the stories I'm going to share with you tonight are from the research, a couple hundred days of field research that I did for the book, Tahoma and Its People. It was published in 2020 by Washington State University Press. And you might know that Tahoma is one of several Native American names for the mountain. And if you'd like me to talk more about that, just ask that question at the end. I did study one of the original languages of the Puget Trough for many years. And so I know a little bit about the language, a little bit about some of the meanings of some of the words and those sorts of things. So let's get after it. So tonight's talk, and I have a handful of talks that I give on Mount Rainier. Tonight's talk I call Special Birds of Mount Rainier. You might know that. And after you've seen the talk tonight, you might understand that we could also have called it Shooting Owls, Kidnapping Eggs, and Birds Flying 100 miles an hour, because all of those things are going to be talked about in this presentation. But I didn't want to set anybody off about shooting owls or kidnapping eggs, so let's just stick with Special Birds of Mount Rainier to get ourselves started. And I generally assume that folks at an Audubon group are birders or budding birders or interested. And so, and if I know birders, most of us, we are birding all the time, right? I'm sitting at my desk and I look out the window at the chickadees and house finches and bush tits and the Buick's wrens that are coming by. We walk from the house to the car, we're birding, right? So let's start with a little warm up. I'm going to show you some slides of some of the common birds at Mount Rainier. Let's just start with a big picture kind of common, and we're going to narrow then our circle a little bit to get down to where we'll actually be talking about 3 very special birds, all of which are protected under the Endangered Species Act, all of which occur at Mount Rainier or in its neighboring watersheds. So here's a warm-up. Take a good look at this. See if you remember who this is. This is a common subalpine and alpine bird, known to many folks as camp robbers. And I'm probably not the only person who still wants to call these Canada jays, or gray jays rather. And now Canada jay is the newer name, but we've called them gray jays forever, right? Member of the corvid family. Here's your next quiz bird. This is the closest relative to the black-capped chickadee that you may have seen out at your feeders today. We certainly had some black-caps here in Enumclaw. And this, of course, is the mountain chickadee. Here's our next warm-up. Well, let's see, Jeff, if it's blue and if it's a bird, I wonder if it's a bluebird. As a matter of fact, the mountain bluebird is one of the earliest returning migrants to subalpine and alpine environments in the springtime. So if you can get up to the mountain early enough, you will see mountain bluebirds early in the season as they're beginning their nesting cycle. I think this next one might be a call, might be an audio. So see if you can hear this. All right, here comes your visual cue. Oh boy, who are we looking at here? Well, of course, you and I, older birders, experienced birders, long-timers, we used to call these blue grouse. They've been split. We now call these sooty grouse that are out here on the coast. And then I believe the inland species is called dusky grouse. So this is a sooty. Beautiful photograph taken by one of my student interns from Evergreen up at the mountain a couple of years ago. I have one of my mentors, my birding mentors, always said that of the grouse, he said, you never find grouse, they find you. And if you've experienced spooking one as you're walking down the trail and they take off loudly and I just about have a heart attack, then you know what I mean. They tend to find us. It's hard for us to find them sometimes. Sooty grouse. And I think this is our final warm-up bird. And another one of the corvids. And I think of the Clark's Nutcracker as being one of the best dressed birds on the mountain. I mean, don't you just love that almost a tuxedo look, right? And it is perched in a white bark pine. And perhaps you know some of that story. Entire books have been written about the mutualist relationship between Clark's Nutcracker and white bark pine, how Clarkies collect and cache the seeds. These are not airborne seeds. These are seeds that they cache. That's the new crop, the new forest of white bark pine comes from the caches that the Clark's Nutcrackers do not go back and get the next season. And there's plenty more to talk about that. White bark pine is a really important alpine species. So again, feel free to ask a question and we can talk more about that later. Then beyond these common birds that most of us see many of the times that we're in the alpine or subalpine areas, whether we're at Mount Rainier or whether we're up in your area in the Cascades, there are a few birds that bring folks from far away to Mount Rainier. And I think of three as being kind of target birds for people who are coming from out of the area. And so let's quiz ourselves on those three birds. Kind of an unassuming little character. And honestly, I don't often see them on a lawn or on the grass like this. The Gray-crowned Rosy-Finch is one of the toughest customers in North America. They are adapted to tolerate some of the harshest environments that we know of. And these are the birds that I see at Mount Rainier, usually pecking insects off of patches of snow around July and August. That's about when I see them. Another bird that folks travel a long distance to try to get a look at is, and you're probably guessing it's a ptarmigan, and you did well, white-tailed ptarmigan. And there has been some things in the news about the subspecies at Mount Rainier possibly being a candidate for protection under the Endangered Species Act. And I don't know much more about that. I haven't seen much in the news lately, but this another member of the so-called chicken family related to the grouse. And again, ptarmigan is another one of the birds that I never seem to find them. They find me. And I've been seeing fewer and fewer of them in the last 5 to 10 years. Didn't see any last season at all up at Mount Rainier. And then the last kind of target species that folks come to the mountain to see. Here's an audio clue for you. Here you go. Here's your visual. Cute little bugger, of course, the Boreal Owl, which full disclosure, I have never seen at Mount Rainier National Park. And let me tell you, I've looked for this little bugger in the right habitat tons and tons of times, have never crossed paths with a Boreal Owl. So let's now narrow our focus to the 3 species that, as I mentioned, are protected under the ESA. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done in the field, either with them or looking for them or listening for them, and give you a kind of an update on their status, what the trends of these birds are, what kind of work is being done on their behalf, and hopefully that will generate a lot more questions, a lot more things for us to think about and talk about at the end. So here's our first bird, and here's an audio clue. So here you go. That's kind of a short clip, so let's hear it again. Well, here's your multiple choice. Is it A, woodsy owl, B, a northern spotted, C, great gray, or D, barred owl? You're right. The northern spotted owl is the only subspecies of the spotted owl that we have in the Pacific Northwest. And we know these birds as inhabitants of the mature and old growth forests, right? That's where they nest primarily. They cover huge ranges. In this area, their primary food source is northern flying squirrel. And a pair of spotted owls can go through about 500 flying squirrels in a year. So that's more than, on average, it's about a squirrel and a half a day. So they're busy, and that is primarily their food source here in our area. We also, those of us that have been around for a while and have been in the region for a while, also know the story that this is a bird whose numbers were decimated by the whole-scale logging industries of old growth in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it was in 1990 that environmentalists, conservationists, folks like you and me, and biologists won a huge victory when this bird was listed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act as a threatened species, where it remains today. Well, because of that, and because of the interest in the bird that goes back decades, there has been a long-term population study of northern spotted owls at a number of locations up and down the West Coast. And in fact, one of the survey spots is at Mount Rainier. So what I'd like to do is kind of invite you to come with me on a bit of a virtual field trip where we will actually go into the field. The idea, what we're hoping for, if we get lucky, what we're hoping for is this. We're hoping to end up face-to-face with an adult northern spotted owl. Now, you will notice in this female, first of all, what she's eating, that does not look like a wild mouse, does it? So that's a lab-raised mouse. More about that in a minute. You'll also notice she has a fancy pink and white bracelet on, a band, and that would tell us that this bird has been encountered previously by biologists. So what our job will be is to grab our day pack with snacks and water. Someone is going to carry a little plastic container of several lab-raised mice. And we'll also have with us a digital playback machine so that we can play calls of the spotted owls. And the idea is to walk in known habitat of the spotted owls, play the calls, and if and when we get a response, we will charge off in the direction of the call, off trail, watch your step, jumping over logs, trying to avoid potholes, trying to head in the direction of the owl of where the call came from. And on this particular day, you and I get really lucky. You might notice that there is a researcher at the very bottom of the photograph. And what Keith is doing there with that long pole is he has kind of a hoop-like device with a trigger on his end of the pole, and he is about to noose one of the spotted owlets that you see here. And there's another second one right above him. So how does this work? Well, when we hear the call and we get close enough to where we think the adult owl is calling, we'll lay one of the mice down out in an open area or on a stump, stand back, and that adult bird will fly down, swoop down, grab that mouse, go to a perch, and bolt that mouse down, eat it whole, swallow it. We set a second mouse down on the stump, wait a few moments, and the parent bird comes in again, grabs the mouse, but this time flies off in the direction of its young. And so again, we take off, running at top speed as best we can, following the owl through the woods until it leads us to this site. So these birds are pretty comfortable around humans, fairly tame, easily approachable, and so pretty easy to catch here. And then once they're captured, they are weighed. Several measurements are taken. You might be able to notice on this bird or on this bird, it's got a new band on. It's been banded. So these are fledgling northern spotted owls that would be first-year birds. This is August, and they're several weeks old at this point. And so after all the measurements are taken, the birds are released, set free, and data is obviously super important to this study. So let's take a look at some of what the data has told us in over 20 years of monitoring. So you see across the horizon of this graph, the number of years that records have been taken, and going up the left-hand side of the table, the population size. We're looking at three different sites here, one at Olympic, one at Mount Rainier, and one in Cle Elum, represented by each of these different shapes. When the study began in year one, the number of birds that they recorded that year was recorded as 100%. So that was 100% of the population. If we just follow the Rainier population through 20 years, we see that it dropped from 100% of its size to 40% of its size. So at Mount Rainier, over a 20-year span, there was a 60% decline at Mount Rainier in the number of spotted owls that were recorded. Pretty big drop. And you can see that it is not only at Rainier, similar drop at Olympic, even more drastic drop in Cle Elum, and this is a trend region-wide that all populations of northern spotted owls are at risk or in some cases greatly imperiled. Well, this got biologists pretty nervous when they started to look at this data, even though the bird was protected by the ESA, even though much of the large-scale old-growth logging had been stopped, the bird's numbers continued to drop. And they wanted to know why. What's going on? Why the decline? Well, there had been a tremendous loss of old-growth forest habitat. And even between the 1990s and 2012, we continued to lose forest habitat that would have been good, between good and optimum habitat for spotted owls to nest in, over 1.6 million acres in these three states. And a bigger reason, or as big or bigger reason, was that biologists discovered that there was an interloper had come onto the scene that was causing further decline in the northern spotted owl populations. Who was it? What is it? You may know the answer to that question, and that is the barred owl. The barred owl is kind of a super predator in this situation. They have expanded their range in the last 100 years from the mostly in the east, Midwest in the east, out into the Pacific Northwest, where they started to show up, I think, about the beginning of the 20th century. These are highly adaptable owls. The barred owls can adapt to tons of different kinds of habitats. They can eat more in terms of their diet. It's more wide-ranging. And they have some reproductive advantages, including they raise more young more often than spotted owls, and they're about 20% larger. And you add all this together, and it really is pretty bad news for the northern spotted owls. And biologists determined that it was the influx and the expansion of the barred owl populations that was also really affecting the population of northern spotted owls. So a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of worrying, a lot of thinking, a lot of questions, a lot of discussing, debating, and arguing about what to do. And finally, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided that it was going to try, as an experiment, a pilot project that they called the Barred Owl Removal Program. And what they actually did was they trained biologists to use 12-gauge shotguns to kill barred owls that were in known spotted owl habitat. And they started with a pilot program in Redwood Creek. And their numbers, their data immediately showed them that where barred owls had been removed from habitat, spotted owls returned quickly. And so they decided, the Fish and Wildlife Service decided to expand the program. And so now it has taken place in 3 areas, not at Mount Rainier, but 1 in Cle Elum and 2 in Oregon. And if you look at the red or pinkish polygons, those are the treatment areas. Those are where owls were actually removed from. And the blue polygons are the control areas where they did not remove owls from. So now we can take a look at that data and then kind of boil that down and get to find out benefits, cost benefits of this kind of project. All told, that over 2,000 barred owls had been removed. And we're going to take a quick look at a bar graph now, 5 years from 2015 through 2019, going across the bottom. NB is the non-breeding season. And I believe the blue signifies the Cle Elum population. So the first year non-breeding season, biologists took out, looks like about 120 or 125 barred owls were removed. Second season, that looks like they removed about 75 or 80. In the breeding season of 2017, they took a break and did not remove any barred owls during the breeding season. So you can see through each of these 3 locations, the number of owls removed over each of these seasons. And now what I'd like to do is just kind of distill that down. So what does that mean? So here are some results of that removals. In the control areas, that's where they did not remove barred owls, the spotted owl pairs continued to decline, and they declined by 83%. In the treatment areas where barred owls were removed, the spotteds increased by 12%. So a pretty marked difference. A huge cost, and I'm sure more than just a couple people here are bothered and upset by the notion of killing one bird to save another, and that is in fact a difficult decision that the Fish and Wildlife Service made in an attempt to save the spotted owls from extinction. So in terms of the future, what do things hold? Presently, plans to continue barred owl removals, possibly up to about 3,600 individuals. And it will be interesting to see if there is any talk in the future about whether the listing for the spotted owl changes from threatened to endangered. That would afford it some more protections, maybe some more funding, and it would see whether or not there is a chance that the spotted owls can rebound. But this is certainly a bird at Mount Rainier that is, I think most biologists who work with this species would certainly say that this is a bird whose future is definitely delicate and in the balance. And so as we move to the second special bird of Mount Rainier, this is also a bird that you're going to see that is also in a precarious situation, and similar in some ways in terms of loss of habitat has also impinged on this bird's chances as well. So let's move on to our second bird. Take a look at this. It's on water, Jeff. Yes, it is. All right, let's figure out who it is. Your choices are A, great auk, B, Cassin's auklet, C, marbled murrelet, D, pigeon guillemot. Well, if you went with marbled murrelet, congratulations. And if you're like me, most of the times when I see marbled murrelets, they're either distant on the water like this, or they're flying away from me like this, or better yet, they dive under the water and you miss them altogether. For frame of reference, here is apparently one marbled murrelet in the hand is worth two in the water. And this is being held by a state biologist. And so to give you an idea, marbled murrelet's about the size and shape of like a papaya. Okay, I have a hunch that murrelets fly a whole lot better than a papaya flies, and I'm not sure which tastes better. I know that murrelets were definitely on the menu of Native American groups and probably non-Native groups as well. But let's get a little closer look at marbled murrelets. These are a member of the Alcidae family, which puts them as cousins to the puffins, the guillemots, the murres, those kind of birds. Did you know the story of the last nest in North America? And this is an Audubon story. In the 1970s, this was the last bird of the nesting birds in North America that nobody knew where marbled murrelets nested. So in 1970, the Audubon Society basically put out a reward to say a cash reward for the first verified nest of the marbled murrelet. And actually, it wasn't until a few years later, a tree surgeon, an arborist, was a couple hundred feet up a Doug fir in a state park in California, and lo and behold, came face to face with a marbled murrelet chick. They probably scared the heck out of each other. And the chick fell out of the nest. And it actually died the next day, I think, or 2 days later. But that was the first verified nest of the marbled murrelet. We'll take a look at their range from South Central California all the way up the coast through Oregon, Washington, up BC, and all the way out the Aleutian chain are where marbled murrelets are found. And if we zoom in to take a look, this is the Washington coast here. Neah Bay, Cape Flattery, all right. And if we take a look here, these dots are all breeding season occurrences where marbled murrelets have been recorded. Well, you would imagine this is a seabird. These are birds that, you and I have seen them on Puget Sound or out in the open waters in the water. But when you take a look, you would expect occurrences of the birds to be along the coast, right? But what about these inland occurrences here? What about all these? What about here at Mount Rainier, for Pete's sakes? What the heck is going on? Well, here's the crazy, and here's why it was such a mystery for so long where these birds nested. These may be the only, but certainly one of the only birds that we know of, only seabirds, that nests in old-growth forests. And we don't have a confirmed nesting at Mount Rainier National Park, but I can tell you where to go to listen for them in the breeding season, and that I've listened for them and heard them many times. So this is a single marbled murrelet egg. They lay one egg. Usually most of the way up a Doug fir in this area. They nest mostly in Doug fir. You see that doesn't look like much of a nest. It's usually a moss-lined depression. Photographs of these sorts of things are few and far between, as you can imagine. And isn't it cool that a person named Hatch is a biologist that works with the Forest Service, that works with marbled murrelets? Isn't that wild? So here's another shot of a marbled murrelet on the nest. And so what goes on is that the birds in March lay, February or March, lay one egg. No, wait, I think I have that wrong. That's later in the season. I'm sorry, I got a little confused. More like in the late spring, they lay the one egg. And then these birds, the pair take turns incubating the egg, and it incubates for about 28 days. Each parent bird stays on the egg for a 24-hour shift, while the other bird goes out, in this case, out into Puget Sound to feed. And they trade places each morning just at around first light. So I worked with some biologists at Mount Rainier and was able to find out that there are a number of places, watersheds and rivers, where they have come into the park, but one of the most prominent locations where the birds have been recorded is up the Carbon River Road. And so these birds, they are, as you can see here, they're kind of cryptically colored. They're incredibly fast flyers. They really have been clocked at up to 100 miles an hour. They average 40 to 50 miles an hour. The location where I have listened to marbled murrelets is up on Falls Creek. It's about 45 or 47 miles from Puget Sound. So each day, each bird is making one trip down from where it's nesting, presumably. Again, we don't have a confirmed nesting site, but there's bird activity in the morning, and then one bird goes down to Puget Sound, feeds for the day, comes back 24 hours later, and replaces its mate. So, as I mentioned, these birds are super fast flyers. They're only active in the really dark times, early morning. They're cryptically colored. They're solitary nesters. Here's a bird, if you need a helper, here's a bird that's hidden in here a little bit. So these birds are incredibly difficult to actually see. And in fact, in my many trips up the Carbon, I have never seen a marbled murrelet in the summertime. But what we listen for is their call. And if you can hear this, this is what we listen for. So that keer allows us to understand that there is birds in the area. Again, whether they're nesting or not, we don't know, but it's during the nesting season when they occur in various rivers of the park, and I'm talking about in the Carbon River area. So you would think with all of these adaptations to be secretive, to be unnoticed, you would hope that they would, be thriving. And the fact of the matter is they're actually predated on quite heavily. Up to about 75% of the marbled murrelet nestlings are lost to predators, primarily the corvids, so the jays, crows, and ravens, even to such a degree that in some recreation areas in California, rangers have adapted a slogan that goes something like, feed a jay, kill a murrelet, in a way to get visitors to understand the link between feeding these birds. It brings them into an area where murrelets may be nesting, and that makes the murrelets pretty easy pickings for these birds. But even predation is not the biggest of their troubles. For the marbled murrelets, similar to the spotted owls, it's been a loss of nesting habitat, particularly in Washington, where the birds are not doing well. And if you are a longtime birder like myself, and you have said recently, man, I don't see as many marbled murrelets as I used to, well, there's a reason for that. because we don't have as many birds on the water. In that 15-year period, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife found a 44% drop in the number of marbled murrelets on the water in an on-water survey. So the numbers are down. The birds are doing better in Oregon and California. They've dropped precipitously in Alaska, where there are still cajillions of them, but their numbers have really crashed in the last 25 years. But they're in such trouble here in the state that Fish and Wildlife, State Fish and Wildlife, has recommended that the marbled murrelet be moved to endangered status. And it brings some questions. One is researchers are wondering whether or not it would help if incentives could be given to landowners, tax breaks, to preserve or improve habitat. Marbled murrelets do not do well with marginal habitat or edge habitat. They really need good internal, well-developed, mature or old-growth habitat. And so that could be one thing to preserve and improve habitat might be one thing. There's also a question as to whether or not these birds can adapt to nesting in second growth forests. And speaking of climate change, people want to know, researchers want to know, what effects on the forage fish that they feed on will there be in terms of the long-term survivability of the marbled murrelets as ocean waters, waters in Puget Sound continue to warm? What effect does this have on the forage fish, the northern herring, the anchovies, the sand lances that these birds eat primarily and bring to their young? There's a crazy fledging story of these young birds that's just remarkable. And again, I'll just save that for the question and answer period. But if you want to know a crazy story about the marbled murrelets, I'm happy to tell you about how it goes for the bird when it is ready to fledge all by itself from its forest nest. So these are two birds that we've taken a look at, special birds at Mount Rainier, the northern spotted owl, the marbled murrelet. And as we move into our third and last bird, we get a little bit of a lift, of good news. There's actually quite a good news story that goes on for our third bird here, which incidentally, this subspecies is not found within the confines of Mount Rainier National Park. You and I might see horned larks up on the mountain, and I see them every summer up on the mountain. But we're going to talk about a subspecies of the horned lark that is a prairie bird. And so this is a shot of the Nisqually Prairie. You can see Mount Rainier there in the distance. And so let's get acquainted with our bird here. Who is this? Is it A, angry bird, B, a pipit, C, a western meadowlark, or a D, a horned lark? Look at those fancy bracelets. Look at those three bands. So that tips you off that this bird is well acquainted with biologists. It does look like an angry bird, doesn't it? But no, it is a horned lark. And this is the subspecies Strigata, Eremophila alpestris strigata. The streaked horned lark, this is 24 subspecies of horned larks. Who knew, right? We hope they never split them into 24 different species, because that would drive the listeners among us crazy sorting them out. But the streaked horned lark is a bird of the prairie, the native prairie that once stretched from Canada all the way down into Oregon, hundreds of miles. And what we have left is just a scant few percent, just a few square miles of good remaining virgin prairie, if you will. And you probably know that any time that we're talking about a loss of habitat, that is going to signal a huge decline in the biodiversity. At my last research, there was something like 46 prairie plants that were on various watch lists, endangered, threatened, protected lists at the state and federal level, 46 plants. And nearly half of the bird species have either had a population loss, they've had their range reduced, or they've been extirpated, that is, made locally extinct altogether. So this is a bird in a very precarious situation, a very precarious habitat. And if we look historically where streaked horned larks may have been found. We see that they may have been on various places. There's records that suggest, evidence suggests they were on Vancouver Island, here in the Puget Trough, out along the coast, along the Columbia, and then down in the Willamette Valley. Where we have them today, if we look at just in our area, in the Puget Sound region, there's a handful of South Puget lowland sites. We're going to zoom in on one of those in a moment. There are a few coastal sites, and there are a few along the Columbia River. So these are current streaked horned lark nest areas. Okay, so let's again take another virtual field trip. And let's go to Joint Base Lewis McChord. If you can believe that, those of you that are in the know that Joint Base Lewis McChord is kind of a hot spot for streaked horned larks. It's also ground zero for some amazing restoration projects, some really great work that's going on with a variety of partners at Joint Base Lewis McChord. So this is the big Army and Air Force base, the joint base that's between Tacoma and Olympia. And the next time you drive through this area, you'll see the road has been redone. The traffic is not quite as bad as it used to be. But if we look at our map here, all of the yellow polygons are Joint Base Lewis McChord proper, and the black polygons are occupied lark study sites as of a couple of years ago. Okay? And there's also a site out at the Olympia Airport and out at the Shelton Airport, Sanderson Airport, out in Shelton. Now, these birds are protected, and these birds are only present during the breeding season. So obviously, you and I are not invited to go looking for these birds. But the best that we can do right now is, if you want to come with me, we can go out onto JBLM, onto some of the Nisqually Prairie, get out into the prairie in the field, and see what we can find in terms of some horned larks. Do you see any? Do you see any horned larks? Okay, look closer. Do you see any now? Here's a helper if you still need some help. So these birds are ground nesters, and I kind of smack my head to say ground nester. What a great idea. The good news is, you see the young are quite cryptically colored, and the adult birds really build a very well-concealed nest in a clump of prairie grass. So they're still subject to predation. Western meadowlarks, northern harriers, garter snakes, coyotes. Apparently, all of those organisms love omelets, or they love fresh eggs, and they will all predate on the streaked horned lark nests. And again, even though predation was a problem for the marble murrelets, as it is for the streaked horned larks, that's not their biggest problem. But here is an example of predation. Why does this researcher look so frumpy? Why is he so sad? Well, look closely at what's in his hand. This is a streaked horned lark nest that has been predated on. You can see the egg that's been punctured here, and that this nest then is abandoned by the adults. But more than predation, what biologists were startled by when they started looking at their data was that the hatch rates for these birds at Joint Base Lewis McChord did not match up. They were not competitive with hatch rates at birds in other more robust sites. The hatch rates were low, and the recruitment of young birds into the adult population was also low. Their fledging rates were low. And so that was a signal that there was a lack of genetic diversity to biologists. And so they hatched a plan, and pardon my pun, but they cooked up a project that they called the Genetic Rescue Project. And this is fancy language, my friends, for an elaborate kidnapping plot. This is what this is really about, is a kidnapping plot. So what the biologists did was they found a really good, healthy, vibrant, robust population of streaked horned larks in Corvallis, at the airport in Corvallis, Oregon. And they arranged with biologists there to swoop down in the breeding season when the conditions were perfect, and to scoop up a nest with eggs in it from the Corvallis Airport and transport it up to JBLM, plant it into an area at JBLM where they knew paired streaked horned larks were, but had not yet built a nest. And the idea was that they hoped that they could basically trick the parent birds at JBLM into raising, incubating and raising young that they did not biologically produce. It seemed like a crazy idea, and believe it or not, sometimes crazy ideas work really well. So Tremaine here, that is not a pan of lasagna that she's taking to the company picnic. That is a plug-in incubator. She has just returned from the several-hour drive from Corvallis back to Joint Base Lewis McChord with, you guessed it, a nest of streaked horned lark eggs. Now I should mention that these the birds that streaked horned larks in general, they will re-nest up to several times in a season. So for them to get one clutch of eggs stolen, if you will, taken from them and moved up to JBLM does not mean that those birds won't nest. They will re-nest and they will try again. So if the biologists keep track of what they're doing, which of course they do, then they know approximately where they can take nests from and how many they can take without damaging the viability of the population at the Corvallis Airport. So if things go perfectly, according to plan, you might end up with something like this. Now, this is a different clutch, not the one that I just showed you. This is just a little fur ball, don't you think? Look at this. Let's see if we can find out how many birds are in this clutch. Here's one beak, two. Do you see them now? Can you see the beaks? There's four. There's five. See any more? One more, six beaks. So this was an extremely healthy, extremely productive female to raise 6 birds. Average clutch size is like 3 to 5. So she really went over the top on this one, raised 6 birds. As we start to finish up here, I want to introduce you to Brian. He is one of the original rock stars of the Genetic Rescue Project. And look at all the bracelets he's sporting. So he's probably knows some of the researchers by name as many times as he's probably been recaptured and reweighed. Brian is a success story because he was one of the first birds to be translocated as an egg from Corvallis to JBLM. He hatched, he fledged, and he returned at least a couple of seasons back to JBLM to breed there, hence bringing in his strain of genetic diversity and helping pump up the genetic diversity of the JBLM streaked horned lark population. Pretty cool story. There's more good going on with the streaked horned larks. This is my good friend Adrian Wolf, a researcher who's done a lot of work, a lot of research, and a lot of writing on the streaked horned larks. He's got a nestling here at JBLM. And one of the other things that they started to do on base was they began a nest finding project. They got people on the ground in the spring surveying for streaked horned lark nests, and then they would mark them with GPS waypoints. And then they would transmit that information to the airfield managers, to the military people who schedule training operations, and those folks responded by avoiding areas where there was evidence of streaked horned lark nesting. So that nest finding activity reduced the direct impacts to such a degree. Look at the increase at McChord Field in 8 years, 6-fold from 8 pairs to 50 pairs. On the historic native prairie, similar from 12 pairs to 40 pairs in the last 10 or 11 years. So really big increases just from this nest finding activity, and also working with people to understand, to change their mowing regimes, for example, to not mow in areas where streaked horned larks are nesting. Now the news isn't all super fantastic because off base at Olympia and at Shelton airports, they still have not enacted any of these kind of measures. But the state continues to monitor the decreasing lark numbers at these airports, and they're continuing to work with those airport managers, hoping that they can get them to take on some of these measures, like surveying for nests and changing their mowing practices. So let's put a wrap on things for tonight. And as we do, I've just got a couple of questions for you. that I'd like you to take a look at for each of our three birds, just to kind of help you land on, I think, maybe some of the big ideas, some of the main ideas. So let's start with northern spotted owls. This is a true false. They're declining at Mount Rainier, but are doing well in other portions of their range. Is that true or false? That's false. They're not doing anywhere in their range very well at all. Second is multiple choice. The two key factors in the decline of northern spotted owls are A, the loss of old growth habitat, B, poaching by hunters, C, competition from barred owls, D, lack of prey. So we're looking for two factors that have been key in their decline. And they are A, the loss of old growth, and C, competition from barred owls. All right, let's take a look at a couple questions that deal with the marbled murrelet. They appear to be the only alcid that nests in old growth forests. So far as I know, you may know different, and if so, point me to the literature. I haven't been able to find any evidence yet. So far as we know, they appear to be the only alcid that nests in old growth forests. And number 4, their numbers may improve with two developments. And they are A, breeding programs, train the birds to have larger clutches. Chuckle, chuckle. B, landowners can be persuaded to preserve habitat. C, predator removal programs begin and succeed. D, if murrelets can adapt to nesting in second growth forests. So we're looking for two things that researchers are wondering and hoping might be able to turn the tide for the marbled murrelets. Those two developments would be B, landowners preserve habitat, and whether or not murrelets can adapt to nesting in second growth forests. And finally, a couple questions for the streaked horned lark. Just one of many prairie bird species impacted by habitat loss. True or false? And that is absolutely true. And the multiple choice. All of these factors contribute to the lark's recovery, except one. It is increasing the frequency of mowing. B, the Oregon Nest Translocation Project. C, nest finding and other conservation measures. D, communicating nest locations to airfield managers. All of these things help the lark except one thing, and that is A, increasing the frequency of mowing. Well, before we get to the question period, I've got just a couple of quick public service announcements, if you will. If you'd like a copy of the book, it's easy to get through me, through my website, or indie booksellers. Frequent your own bookseller, or you can get them online, of course. And I've got a couple of other talks, if you're interested. Tahoma's Biggest Stories is, I guess, kind of the flagship talk. And I love to talk about the presence of Native people at the mountain. That we didn't know very much about this at all 50 or 60 years ago. Did you know that Native Americans have been going up to Mount Rainier for over 9,000 years? There are now over 100 known archaeological locations, evidence of locations at Mount Rainier. Camps, butchering sites, all sorts of areas at Mount Rainier. Really fascinating. And the other big story is the effects of climate change at Mount Rainier are pretty widespread and way beyond the retreating glaciers that most people are familiar with. But debris flows, other hazards, flooding, and the effects on some of the plant and animal communities, all of those things I cover in that talk that's called Tahoma's Biggest Stories. And the other talk that I like to give is a virtual field trip in the Nisqually River watershed. And while I understand you folks live up north and some of you wouldn't even know the Nisqually River watershed unless you were told that you were in it, this is a great story because we trace the Nisqually River from its origins at the terminus of the glacier all the way out to where it empties into one of our other favorite places in the whole world, Billy Frank Jr. Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge. And there's just this is a real landmark watershed. The work that folks have done over the last 50 years here, the projects, this is award-winning stuff, really cutting-edge conservation and preservation work in this watershed, and talk a lot about those projects. So with that, we'll call it good. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm sure looking forward to some great questions and great conversation. So thank you for your attention, and let's have some fun with some questions.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really, really a great talk. And although a lot of not great news for those species, but some good news. So,
go ahead, Carla. I'm also looking at the questions here in the chat feature, so I can take a couple of those.
Okay, let's see. Let's see where they start here.
I've got them. Yeah. So here's one.
Okay.
I think this might be from John. I'm not sure. I think it's from John. Could you tell us more about how whitebark pines are doing and what the future holds for them around Tahoma? So you remember at the beginning, I mentioned Clark's Nutcrackers and the mutualist relationship that they have with whitebark pines. These cones are very tight, the whitebark pine cones, and so these are not air pollinated. It's not like some of the other, like Western white pine, has open cones and the seeds are scattered by the air, by the breeze. So these trees are dependent on the birds to harvest the seeds, and then they cache them. Whitebark pines in the region are not doing well. You might be familiar with white pine blister rust. It started in the area in the 1930s. Many trees in our region have been infected with white pine blister rust, and the outlook is not good. There's a lot of really good research and good work that's being done. As it turns out, researchers have found that some of the most disease-resistant whitebark pines in the region are at Mount Rainier. They really don't know why, but those that are disease-resistant, then those seeds are collected, they're scarified, they're raised in nurseries and greenhouses, and then those are later planted out into the wild, knowing that they are at least disease resistant. So will there be whitebark pines in 100 years? Some researchers are not so sure, but there is a lot of work that's taken place on their behalf, some of it at Mount Rainier. What are they doing? I ran into one of the vegetation crews last summer. They're actually going to start putting nets around disease-resistant trees so they can determine whether a tree has white pine blister rust or whether it's disease-resistant. They're starting to put netting around the cones to keep the birds from taking the cones so that then researchers can climb the trees, harvest these disease-resistant cones, and then they'll extract the seeds and then again raise whitebarks in the nurseries. Crazy.
Great. Yeah. Well, it's good that they're doing lots of research on it. So let's see. Allison Warner just wanted to mention that she really liked the little quiz at the end.
Oh, nice. So, thank you, Allison. And Libby, you are right that ancient murrelets do nest on the ground in old growth, and I think I might have to change the way I say that. So they are, and also there are marble murrelets. I believe there are also ground nesters in other places in Alaska. But so far as I know, I think, help me, I'd love it to be different, but I think that they might be, marble murrelets might be the only seabird that nests in old growth trees. I think you're right. Someone else had told me that ancients nest on the ground in old growth. Yeah, so thank you. Let's see.
It looks like Tim Mans has a question sort of at the end of his comment about what an interesting presentation it was. And he says, interesting to learn about the streaked horned lark, a bird we don't see in Skagit County, but I see from one of the maps you showed that they used to occur here.
According to the work of one of the biologists, that's because before our area was so developed, so much prairie that did exist, more or less along the I-5 corridor. So with with the incoming European American settlers and all of that turned to grazing land, farmland development, those sorts of things, that caused all the prairie to be decimated. So it was that loss of habitat that caused those birds to basically become locally extinct. And according to one researcher, at least, that's some of the areas, as you notice, where they believe that streaked horned larks may have nested at one time. I've got another question here, Carla. And Libby, I wondered if we knew each other. So this is from Libby. Your name just when you said that you were a backcountry ranger at Ohanapecosh, and there's actually it's disputed what Ohanapecosh, and then she asked, what does that mean? And I'm guessing that you want to know what Ohanapecosh means. It depends on which language scholar you talk to, but one of the interpretations that I recall is that Ohanapecosh might mean something about reflective waters. And if you know as well as I do how beautiful the Ohanapecosh River is, and something about person looking in and seeing their face reflected, or rivers like a mirror, or waters like a mirror, or something like that. That's as close as I can get for the meaning for Ohanapecosh. Approximate range sizes from Steve Phillips. Sorry if I missed this. What are approximate range sizes for marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl? Gosh, the range for the spotted owls is huge. Gosh, I'd have to look it up, but I think it's thousands of acres. It's a ginormous area that a pair of spotted owls will range. I don't know what the range is for the marbled murrelets. So I can't answer that question, but I do want to tell you a little bit about how the young birds fledge, these marbled murrelets. It's no wonder these birds are on the brink. I mean, here's a seabird that flies, at least 50 miles one way. And when the young bird hatches, the parents have to make multiple trips. They can fly hundreds of miles in a single day feeding the bird, because they return to the nest with one fish, right? One anchovy, kind of like a fish Manchu or whatever you would call it, One fish, gives it to the young bird, turns around and flies back to Puget Sound to get another fish. So at the end of when it's ready to fledge, that young bird has done nothing but live in the nest. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's now near the end of its 28 or 30-day period of getting its flight feathers. It's pecking out its natal down. It's starting to exercise, its wings, do some flapping exercises. And finally, when its genetics tells it that it's time, it stands at the edge of its nest, usually at dusk, and it just throws itself out the nest into the sky, and it starts flapping its wings. And so it's basically doing something it's never done, going somewhere it's never been before, to learn to feed itself in a way that it's never done that either. And so they use, researchers believe that the murrelets use the rivers, in some cases roadways, but primarily rivers, kind of like a compass. They use the rivers as a guide. And so this little bird, which is, not much bigger than your fist, is really airborne And if it should lose altitude in land before it gets to the water, it's basically, that's the end, because they don't have any lift. They don't have any good way to get back up into the air. So they really have to fly nonstop. If I think of like from the Falls Creek area, if they nest there, so 50 miles an hour, they have to fly for an hour nonstop to get to Puget Sound, eventually land there without any help from their parents. So they're separated from their parents once they fledge and they're in the water, and then they have to figure out how to feed themselves and how to evade predators like bald eagles and harbor seals and gulls and all sorts of other things that want to eat murrelet for lunch. So it's a pretty remarkable story that any of them live at all. See if we've got any others.
Let's see. John Day has one more at the end there. Do streaked horned larks nest on coastal faults?
I don't see that.
I've heard them going over at. Yeah, and I didn't see one of the questions that you saw, so I don't know what's going on.
All right. I'm just going to keep scrolling down. Here's a question from Sarah Peterson. Seems like the larks don't need a lot of acreage. Might they be reintroduced to some of our pocket prairies? That's a super good question. I don't know the answer to. That would be a good thing to ask one of these experts like Adrian Wolf, who's worked so many years. And Sarah is a big fan of the prairies, spent lots of time down in the prairies, down in that area. I don't know if that would be a possibility or not. I do know that there's no recent nesting records of streaked horned larks like at Mima Mounds, because I'd asked about that and I talked to the researchers and asked them. So I don't know if they could be reintroduced to some of those areas or not, but that's an interesting thing to think about. Allison thought it was about 2,000 acres for spotted owls. Thank you, Allison. Sometimes my numbers, I turn things around.
And there is a comment from John. Did you see that one? He says he's heard marbled murrelets going over at first light in May at Goldmire Hot Springs, up Middle Fork of the Snoqualmie.
That is amazing, John. That's really cool. And you also asked, John also asked whether streaked horned larks nest on the coastal balds. I don't know, but you've got the right kind of habitat in mind when you're thinking about that. So I don't know. I'd have to talk to a researcher. And he said he met marbled murrelets going up Goldmire Hot Springs. Pretty cool. In May. That's coming into the best time of year. All right. I think if I missed one, just repost it or just speak up.
It looks like you got all the ones. You did get one that I didn't see, but anyways, I don't know why I don't see it, but I think we've, unless anybody has any others, speak up now.
Yeah, great group and really good questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, Jeff, and your other presentations sound really interesting as well. So we'll keep in touch with you.
Be happy to do that.
So, yeah, I really, really enjoyed that. So thank you very much.
Everybody. Thanks for having me.
Okay, and please join us next month on April 12th when we will hear about the birds of the Olympic National Park from a ranger at ONP. So thanks all for attending, and good night.